Hi, everybody. In today's presentation, I'm going to be taking you through a PowerPoint here, which talks about the Every Student Succeeds Act, and specifically how this act defines different tiers of evidence that states can use in deciding which sorts of programs they want to implement. Just a quick introduction, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, was signed in 2015 under the Obama administration. It extends and to a certain extent supplants the No Child Left Behind Act from the Bush administration. The goal of ESSA is to promote student achievement, improve student outcomes, and specifically, I believe, to lower achievement gaps. However, the aspect of ESSA that we're most interested in for this class is how ESSA defines different levels of evidence. So I'm going to take you through this PowerPoint, which was put together by a professor here at the School of Education, Marty West, and also included contributions from a new faculty member, Carrie Conway. We're going to be focusing specifically on the aspects where they discuss evidence in ESSA. I do want to call your attention to the guiding question that they have on page 8, where they remind us that the question that we should be using, we should be asking ourselves when looking at these definitions of evidence is how can we use evidence to improve student outcomes, not simply what does the law tell us that we have to do. So a little bit later in the PowerPoint, they talk about how these categories of evidence play out in the law and what sorts of money can be spent on what sorts of activities. And they are trying to stress here, as we do in this class, that the role of evidence is to help us to make good decisions, not simply to check a bunch of boxes. Certainly, it's important for schools, districts, and states to comply with the law. But the reason that the law is in place is because policymakers, legislators expected that using evidence-based solutions would actually improve student outcomes. So without further ado, we're going to turn to slide 9. We're going to talk about the definition of evidence-based in ESSA. So ESSA has 4 different levels of evidence. A program, activity, policy, etc. can have a strong evidentiary basis, a moderate or a promising evidentiary basis, or alternately, it can still be under evaluation. And ESSA defines these 4 different tiers or levels, and later tells people how this impacts what sorts of money can be spent on what sorts of policies. So on the next page, slide 10, we're going to actually talk about what evidence-based means in ESSA. The top 3 levels require studies which have found statistically significant effects on improving student outcomes based on certain types of evidence. Sort of fall into the top category, the top tier, strong tier. The program, policy, or intervention needs to be supported by at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study. You're probably aware an experimental study is a study which is conducted by randomly assigning students, schools, classrooms, or some other unit to one of 2 conditions, to a treatment condition or a control condition, and then comparing their outcomes. That provides the clearest and, under the ESSA framework, the strongest evidence that an intervention actually had a causal effect on the outcomes of interest. So if there's a program that has at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study in support of it, then it falls into the strong tier. Slightly below that, ESSA defines a moderate tier. A moderate tier, or a moderate program with moderate evidence, is supported by at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study. So this is a term that is not clearly defined in ESSA among some of these other terms. But in general, a quasi-experimental study means a study which does not use random assignment. So it's not strong evidence. However, it uses techniques that are designed to detect causal effects, even in the absence of random assignment. If those are interesting to you, there are classes here at the School of Education and elsewhere which introduce you to some techniques for detecting causal effects in the absence of random assignment. The 3rd tier, a promising tier, these are for programs or interventions which do not have experimental or quasi-experimental studies supporting them. However, they do have at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study So a study which looks at differences between people who were and were not exposed to a particular program, but that also includes statistical controls for selection bias. So it tries to use statistics to adjust for the fact that different students choose to enter a program or not to. And it tries to take out those student level differences in estimating the effect of the program. So this is the lowest of these three tiers. It doesn't rise to the level of strong or moderate evidence, but it is promising. There's some evidence in support of it. I want to just point out at this point that although ESSA is defining these tiers in terms of how strong the evidence is, states might be interested in including other information in deciding whether or not to implement the program, including, for example, how large the effect was in these studies. Is there any conflicting evidence? Were the sites in which these programs were implemented roughly analogous to the places where the states themselves might want to use them? And what was the cost per unit of effect? So now I'm going to move to page 11, slide 11. We're talking about the final tier. So level 4 or tier 4, this is for programs that are under evaluation. So they lack an evidence base. However, they're rooted in theory, in other research. There's a convincing rationale for why they ought to work. And there are efforts underway to provide evidence for this particular program. So these are for things that are being studied and for which there's a good reason to believe that it might work, but the evidence isn't there quite yet. So those are the different tiers that ESSA defines. I would encourage you to read through the rest of this PowerPoint and see how the different tiers impact what states are and are not allowed to do with different programs. But now you have a sense, at least, of how this act talks about evidence.